This is Kettering University.
My name is Leszek Gawarecki. I am the chair of the organizing committee for the Flint International Statistical Conference, FISC 214. So welcome to Flint, welcome to Kettering University, and welcome to the mathematics department, one which tolerates statistics and statisticians. We are privileged to have a university president with such rich academic background and leadership experience. Dr. McMahon has his PhD in physics from one of the finest United States academic institutions, Dartmouth College. His postdoctoral work was in astrophysics. He participated in research that led to cosmological discoveries of objects such as the Great Attractor. This is a gravity anomaly in intergalactic space. The bubble and void structure of the universe, and the Great Wall, not that one of China, but at the time of its discovery, it was the largest structure in the universe known to humans. Those elements are now fundamental in the theory of dark matter. I am sure that Dr. McMahon, with his remark, will inspire every one of us to fully and actively participate in every session of this conference and in every social event as well. It is my pleasure to introduce our president, Dr. McMahon.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for coming this morning, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to Kettering University and to Flint, Michigan. That was a wonderful introduction, Leszek. My father used to say to me, once you make the sale, you should just say thank you and leave the stage, because it can only go down from there. And after an introduction like that, I feel like I should just say thank you, welcome, and take his advice. It's really an honor, though, for us to host at Kettering, to host this most prestigious event, featuring some of the foremost scholars in the world of statistics from around the globe, not only to our university, but to our city as well. For those of you who are not familiar with Flint, Michigan, the city is really the center of the birthplace of the American automotive industry. General Motors was founded here, and the city once served as the home to some of the world's greatest innovators, inventors, business people, leaders, and entrepreneurs. And a fact that's not fully appreciated often is that Flint, Michigan was really, at the turn of the 20th century, was really the Silicon Valley of the United States. It was the home of innovation in the automotive industry. It was an area where people from across the globe were flooding into because of all the great innovations that were occurring in this area. And few periods in history can compete with the levels of innovation and the activity that occurred here in Flint in the early 1900s. It's interesting, in the president's house, where I live from the university's president's house, I have a series of pictures on the wall of individuals in their youth, people whose names are Chrysler and Chevrolet and Buick, whose last names are Mott and Sloan, and people who we think of today as captains of great industry and creators of these enormous global enterprises. And yet the pictures that I have in my house are these people as young men and women, in very modest clothes, doing very simple things as they created an amazing industry of which we all share a part today. And as a result, the city of Flint has an incredible and complex history and a past that's tied to the boom and bust periods in the automotive industry and related industries. But it also has a very, very bright future as we reinvent this community as a knowledge center led by colleges and universities in the area. Kettering University is one of the finest, one of the greatest undergraduate STEM or science, technology, engineering, and mathematics institutions of higher education in the United States. We have some of the highest ranked programs in these areas of any university in the United States. And but we are not alone in this community. We have the University of Michigan Flint, Mott Community College, and soon Michigan State University College of Human Medicine campus here, right all in close proximity in the core of this center, in the center of the city. All of us together are working to redefine Flint as a knowledge-based community and to grow and to reinvent this community going forward. The research capabilities of the faculty, students, and partners here at the university working with all these institutions have the power to be truly transformative for the city of Flint. And we at Kettering are working very, very hard to be an active partner within the city. We're also one of the leading applied research institutions in the country, and our experiential-based education model, which is in fact unique in the United States in the intensity of the cooperative and experiential learning component to our education, and actually was derived from our relationship as we were formed as an institution early in the history of Flint, as defined by our relationship with the automotive industry as it formed. This model combines the theory learned in the classroom with very practical hands-on experience in labs, and particularly in cooperative assignments with one of our 600 corporate partners across the globe. And we do this type of experiential learning better than any institution in the country, and that pays real dividends for our students. On average, Kettering graduates have the highest starting salary and the highest lifetime earning potential of any university in Michigan. And we, in terms of the return on investment of the degree, of the investment in their degree, our students, Kettering University is ranked in the top 50 universities in the nation in terms of the return on investment on a degree. We have 98, our placement rate for our students in positions or in graduate schools vacillates wildly between 98 and 100% every year. And we are one of the top feeder schools for a number of Ivy League and other elite institutions. In fact, about 9 months ago, the Dean of Admissions at the Harvard Business School was asked, how do you get into the Harvard Business School? And she said, among other things, she said, well, we love Kettering University in Flint, Michigan, because of the quality of their students. We were the only university named directly in that article other than Harvard itself. And our alumni include many distinguished leaders of business and academia, including most recently Mary Barra, who's the CEO of General Motors, David Kinney, the CEO of the Weather Channel, the CIO of Walmart, Bob Cagle, who's one of the most successful venture capitalists in the history of Silicon Valley as a Kettering alum. I could literally spend hours listing the notable alumni of the institution. And the educational outcomes that we produce in these areas is really a function of our educational model and how we produce students who are not only very, very capable in terms of their underlying knowledge of theory, but they are also very, very well practiced in its application in real-world context. So our students leave this institution typically with 2 to 3 years of actual real-world experience, and that's an advantage that multiplies for them over time. Kettering's research capabilities, our educational model, and educational outcomes are truly among the elite universities in this country, and we consider it truly an honor to be able to produce those outcomes right here in Flint, Michigan. When the city recently undertook a master planning exercise, the first master plan in 50 years under Mayor Dayne Walling's leadership, not only did higher institutions within the city play a very key role in the development of future vision for the city, but those organizing the process, of course, relied very, very heavily on data and statistics. Their goal for the city was to create a vision for Flint that is vibrant, safe, and supports a diverse economy that uses the city's main assets to their fullest potential. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, to welcome you to Flint. And at this time, it's my pleasure to invite to the stage the mayor of Flint, Mayor Dayne Walling. We're honored very much to have him as our first keynote speaker. And he's here to discuss, among other things, how statistics and data play a vital role in the process of the city's master plan development. Mayor Walling is currently in his second term as Flint's mayor, and working throughout his tenure to bring new economic opportunities to the city, to increase safety, to support access for educational opportunities for Flint residents of all ages, and to help create a vision of a sustainable 21st century economy here in Flint. He serves on the executive committee for the Michigan Economic Development Corporation as chairman of the National Manufacturing Alliance. He's very well published. He's published articles in Governing, Bridge, Smart Growth and New Partners Network, and various city and county publications. He was born and raised here in Flint, and it's a great pleasure, especially to such a distinguished audience of scholars, to note that he is, in fact, a Rhodes Scholar. So we are blessed to have a Rhodes Scholar as our mayor, someone of incredible academic as well as public policy credentials. He's also a Truman Scholar and the only AmeriCorps alum in the country currently serving as a mayor. He received his BA in Social Relations from James Madison College at Michigan State, a second BA in Modern History from St. Peter's at Oxford, MA in Modern History from St. Peter's as well in Oxford, and an MA in Urban Studies from Goldsmiths College at the University of London. He also has pursued doctoral studies in geography at the University of Minnesota with a fellowship from the National Science Foundation. He's an honored colleague and a friend, and it's a delight to welcome him to this conference and to Kettering University. Welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Flint. Thank you, Dr. McMahon, for that very warm and generous welcome. This is a real privilege and honor for me to be able to get this conference started. I hope that you will take a few things from my remarks here this morning. So 4 purposes that I'd like to address. One is that I hope you'll get some sense of the city of Flint itself. That's my way of welcoming you as part of my remarks here this morning. I want you to have an overview of the current master plan for the city, an idea of where we are going as a community and how we're transforming. And then in regards to the conference themes, I do want to look at the data analysis and methods that we've used in the current plan, and also as a historical perspective, knowing that's part of this conference's aim, we're going to look at the city's 2 previous master plans in 1960 and in 1920, done at very different times in the city's life and trajectory, and we'll take a look at the analysis that was done at that time and some of their recommendations. And then lastly, as an elected official, hopefully something unique that I can offer to you as you get into the rest of the conference proceedings is a perspective on how research and analysis can be applied. And from the public side, a user of data, how we can ask for your work to be done in a way that's going to allow us to make better decisions on the public side in our own decision-making processes and our governance, and to offer a few thoughts on how data and analysis can be done that can be consistent with that aim. So with that, Dr. McMahon did a very good job of touching on a few of these elements that I wanted to mention in regards to the city's history. Flint is a very dynamic city. It has a history of progressive transformation with the settlements and trade along the Flint River. It's now often referred to as the vehicle city, and that moniker came from not the auto industry, but actually the city's prominence in carriage making more than 100 years ago. Led by David Buick, Flint was a hotbed for innovation and attracted the entrepreneurs who became the auto industry icons, like Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, Louis Chevrolet, Charles Stewart Mott, who went on to be vice president for General Motors and one of the world's most generous philanthropists, still headquartered right here in Flint. Flint has also been at the forefront of social change. It's the place of the historic success for collective bargaining rights by the United Auto Workers, just a few blocks from where we are now, in the factory areas that surrounded this campus at one time. And then later in the 1960s, the city of Flint was one of the first communities in the United States to adopt a fair housing ordinance as part of the American Civil Rights Movement. Now, the city of Flint and its population has been not only shaped by the physical land features along the Flint River, the business cycle of the automotive industry through the early booms, the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war recovery. And you'll see that as we look back at the city's prior plans, what the implications were for this community at those times. And then more recently, the great changes in robotic technology and new patterns of international trade. But we also want to look at Flint's neighborhoods and its transportation system and commercial areas and how these have been designed in response to public policy decisions as well as social and economic and technological factors. Generally, throughout the city's history, it took what you would call a laissez-faire approach to urban planning. In the city's 150-year history, it's only produced these 3 comprehensive master plans that laid out how public investments and zoning regulations were to be coordinated to create a particular quality of life and support industry and neighborhoods. And of course, one of those was just adopted last fall in 2013. So you effectively had nearly 150 years where there were only 2 times that the city undertook large-scale planning. But nevertheless, Flint is transforming again today in the aftermath of more than 3 decades of global deindustrialization and regional residential and commercial decentralization. And we'll see, are we able to dim the light some? Okay, thank you. So just again, as we get started, as we work our way through the city's current master plan and some comments on the prior plans, I want to bring out a few contributions to the conference. One is, as I mentioned, to consider ways that data can be utilized for public decision making. We're going to examine particularly the city's population against its historical record and projections, and discuss the relationship between statistical and spatial analysis, which is especially important for those of us in elected office who have responsibility for a place that has political boundaries. We want to think about the implications of looking at data within that defined area and looking or not looking at what happens to be around it. So I'll make some comments on that. We'll review the 3 City of Flint master plans, again from 1920, 1960, and 2013, and already talk about the overview of the city. And we'll actually go in reverse chronological order. I don't want to take you too far back in time. I wanted to make sure that we talked about today's current context the most, and then touch on the 1960s and 1920s before having some time for discussion. Those points I already covered. And just to get us started thinking about this spatial variability across boundaries, in the current master plan, we took a close look at our population trends, not only as a city as a whole, but also what's happening within our neighborhoods. So as you may know, if you know something about the Midwest and what's often termed the Rust Belt here, Flint's population has been on a downward trend since approximately 1960, when the previous master plan was adopted. So since that time, our population has declined. This is our residential population, has declined by 48%. And this significant decrease in population, of course, also translates into a loss of city revenue and ability to provide for basic services, which is an ongoing part of governing the city and those challenges. We still have the infrastructure that was built for a much larger community, and we're working through how we right-size that infrastructure for the city's future. Now, our current projections actually show a continued decline of approximately 20,000 people over the next decade. The Master Plan for a Sustainable Flint outlines some innovative methods to retain population and work towards stabilizing the residential population while we strengthen vital city services and also promote this more sustainable set of neighborhoods. Now, we talked a lot in the process about population projections, and you'll see as we go back in time that as hard as one might try to project what's coming in the future, it's a very uncertain science. So we took seriously both the trend data that showed that population was declining, and we also took seriously the challenge of developing public policies that could intervene in that trend line and change the trajectory for the community. And we also, if you see here on the left, we also looked, I know you're not able to read it all, so it's more for the impression. We looked at population change in census tracts across the city. And as you can see, there were population gains in a few places. There was a modest population loss in some places. And then in the areas that are orange and red, there were high population loss areas. So that tells us something about the differentiation in quality of life and attractiveness of various neighborhoods relative to their market value, and reminds us that we not only want to look at population trend lines like you see there on the right with population change at the city and county level, but we want to understand how that's actually happening in neighborhoods. So population at the city scale is only one way to look at the population. Cities are often said to be made up of neighborhoods. And in our planning process, as I mentioned, we look closely at changes and opportunities at the neighborhood level and at the level of other places in the city like downtown and in our key commercial corridors. So you can see from this data of the last 10 years, that's what the data on the left represents. It's census data from 2000 and 2010. So this is something that we take account of in our current work, but it was not addressed in prior master plans. So the prior master plans looked at the city as a whole, and it didn't look at its sub-municipal geographic areas. The other issue with a population at the city scale being the primary lens as it relates to planning in Flint, which is the core city for this mid-Michigan region, is that we're an employment hub. So while Flint's share of Genesee County population has been declining, which is what you see on the right, the city's share of the county's employment base is growing. So indeed, Flint is a regional employment hub, not what you would call a bedroom community. So unlike many communities in the region, and Flint's daytime population is actually larger than its residential population. Large employers like where we are today here at Kettering University have remained in Flint and serve as centers of employment and education. So the number of people commuting to Flint for work is nearly double the number of Flint residents leaving the community for work on a daily basis. We have nearly 30,000 students who are enrolled at Flint's major colleges and universities. So the regional significance of Flint was addressed partially in the 1960 plan as it became apparent that the residential and economic trajectories of Flint could actually be divergent. In the 1960s plan, however, the focus was on infrastructure and connecting employment centers with the growing bedroom communities in the suburbs, whereas in the current plan, we take a comprehensive look at how the inflow of workers also can affect our opportunities to have vibrant parks, entertainment districts, commercial services, the greater downtown area, and what we call the innovation district that stretches along the Flint River from where we are now to the east of downtown at Mott Community College and the Cultural Center. I know you'll have the opportunity to see some of that for yourself while you're here. This includes all of our key educational and medical institutions. So to give you a few of the specific numbers, Flint provides 1/3 of all employment positions in the county, even though the residential population is only 1/5. So this results in the following. When non-residents, employees, and students are combined with residents living and working in Flint, the city's daytime population is conservatively estimated at 130,000, whereas our residential population is just about 100,000. So that's a substantial change in the opportunities in the city when you view it from that perspective of economic activity and employment base versus the strictly residential population. So this outlook for Flint in terms of economic growth is more optimistic as employment in Genesee and Shiawassee counties, the county to our left, to our west, is expected to grow by over 5,000 jobs in the coming years. So what does that mean for a comprehensive plan? How does a community go about dealing with both the variability of population change as well as the inflows of workers and business activity into the city on a daily basis? We came up with this plan, the master plan for a sustainable Flint, and again, the graphics are here more for an impression. All of this is available online at imagineflint.com if you're interested in probing the graphs and tables and data. On the right, you'll see the land use plan for the city of Flint, which shows a variegated pattern of neighborhoods that will be more green, have a lower density, a more suburban quality of life. Places that are yellow, which are a traditional urban American neighborhood, and then the blue and red and orange areas where we have a much higher density, and I'll show you some examples of what we think that looks like. But what we wanted to do was take this more flexible approach to the city's long-term future. Instead of trying to identify the single population projection like previous plans did, we actually developed a flexible framework, and you'll see on the left that we took all of the acres in each of the city's land use typologies. We established a low-end density level. This is a residential population level, a high-end density level, and that allowed us to calculate the city's population carrying capacity anywhere between 75,000, which would accommodate the projected 20,000 loss if we're not able to change that dynamic with economic growth. It also accommodates up to 150,000 people if, in fact, there was another wave of investment and population return to the city through the innovation corridor, through downtown, and the growing eds and meds economy, as it's often called. So this placemaking approach of looking at areas smaller than the city scale itself provides us with a flexible planning framework that accommodates a wide population range within a sustainable, market-viable, livable, and healthy community. So this land use framework and placemaking dial, as I'll bring up here, establishes the parameters and interrelationships of the land use pattern and the development intensity of accommodating today's population, while also being able to adjust to the city's current declining population trajectory or accommodate the growth, as I mentioned. So the purpose of the intensity dial is to show not only that we have a map of what we believe the city's density and land use future will be. But we also think about the interrelationships between those places. So if you can follow the colors, I mentioned yellow there on the upper right is a traditional Flint neighborhood. Now, if the market pressures are such that we decline farther with our residential population, then we can dial down to what's called a green neighborhood, which I mentioned would be more of your suburban density. You may have a quarter acre per house as opposed to a 40 or 50 square foot lot. And the planning framework that we establish in our zoning code would allow the Planning Commission to make that decision, to dial down from a traditional neighborhood to a green neighborhood, which has a different set of requirements for parcel size, for building codes, and at the same time, if market demand increases, then we can dial up to this darker yellow, the mixed residential pattern, which has more duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings. So we're establishing up front not a singular vision for the city, but we're developing this flexible framework. So let me show you a few pictures of what this means. And this is a zoom in of the innovation district around the downtown. And again, you see the variegated pattern of the downtown core, the Kettering Innovation campus to the west, mixed residential apartment buildings surrounding downtown, the cultural center, which you'll see later in your stay, and then the traditional neighborhoods here. This is an aerial of what a traditional Flint neighborhood might look like. You'd have a school or a public building. You'd have houses with driveways. These are 40 to 60 foot lots, relatively dense. You may have a small neighborhood park. Many of our neighborhoods that have lost their population look more like this, where you have green space interspersed where you would have once had houses, but with the right planning and zoning framework, we can actually offer a very high quality of life. This looks a lot more like what you would find in an older suburban subdivision. You still have the street grid, but you have a lot more space. You have room for gardens, for larger lawns, for larger garages. At the same time, in areas where we have more market demand, like around downtown, then we want to build up the density, offer the options of apartment-style living, loft-style living, condominiums. There's not very much of this in the city of Flint because when the city boomed historically, the demand was for single-family housing. So we can line the commercial corridors and major streets with 4-story apartment buildings, duplexes, and still have a residential quality where you're not creating a business district, but you're creating much more density. So this is the range of neighborhoods that we expect to see across the city. The traditional neighborhoods, green neighborhoods, and also mixed density areas. So I mentioned the numbers. This would allow us to accommodate a range between 75,000 and 150,000. In the downtown core, we have the 20-year goal of 5,000 more people living in downtown. In the larger innovation district, we believe we can have an additional 10,000 dwelling units. So this gives you a sense of how we expect the city to grow and change over time, and how we incorporated this lesson from the inaccuracies of previous plans of the need to be flexible. So designing this flexibility into the plan is key because Flint's future population has been a challenge to predict. The 1920s plan predicted more rapid growth than was realized with the challenges of the Great Depression and the start of suburbanization. The 1960 plan also predicted more growth as the but didn't take into account the full pattern of decentralization of the region's population, which turned out to be much greater than expected at that time. Another interesting way to look at this is through the road system. The 1920 and 1960 plans both called for more roads, and in the 1920s plan, the development of the car system, because there were still many people in the 1910s who were getting around by horse and carriage. There was a need to move automobiles more efficiently through the city. And with the new plan, we are actually rethinking streets. You may have heard the term road diet. We want our streets to be more friendly to pedestrians, bicyclists, and the environment, and this is a major shift for a place that's known as the vehicle city. The road diet, as these diagrams show you, is taking something that's currently a 4-lane road, very open, very little to look at as you drive down the road, which accelerates your speed, and changing that to a pattern where you may have 2 road lanes and bicycle lanes. You have trees and activity along the street, which will slow and calm traffic. Other ways to do that with roundabouts, with incurring into intersections, which again slows the traffic. So that's another way to look at this change. I talked primarily about the residential neighborhoods, but every single city system will need to be redesigned for this more flexible future. Our goal is to make the city more sustainable instead of simply being a pass-through for commercial and commercial interests and for commuters. So in terms of the data and analysis, to give you a peek into what we did with this planning process, we used data from the 2010 U.S. Census as well as the 2011 American Community Survey, which represented the most accurate snapshot of Flint's population. These data sources were contrasted with data from the 2000 census to document the demographic shifts and market trends within the community. We also looked at income, housing, and retail demand data from the U.S. Census Bureau sources, the economic census, and also Esri Business Analyst, which is a nationally recognized provider of market and demographic data. We spent a great deal of time converting this data, as you saw, into a spatial schematic where we could compare economic data, housing stock, commercial property conditions, demographics, workforce and educational attributes of the population, as well as activity level and key assets like parks and schools and transit routes. So all of that data was layered together and then used in various ways to project market demand for housing, for neighborhood retail services, for the number of roadway miles that need to be converted or put on a diet. So a great deal of work was done to present this. And I got to thinking for this presentation about how we validated that work. It's something that's very important in the academic community, peer review, this openness and transparency about the work. And the way we did that was we involved a great deal of community input. So a certain type of data validation was done by asking the community if this was accurate and giving them opportunities and workshops to give us their feedback. We also had technical teams convened in each of the main focus areas of the plan, and those technical teams included not only a couple community members, but also professional experts who are working in these fields in and around Flint, as well as academics from all of the colleges and universities in and around Flint who were at the table, reviewing the data, reviewing the projections, helping to make recommendations. And I believe so far we've presented at the American Planning Association and a number of other forums, and we've seen very good feedback on the approach and the both on a realistic nature of what's being proposed as well as the aspirational content of the plan and giving the city an ability to move forward. So I want to spend a few minutes before I take a few questions, if time allows, to talk about the two previous master plans, some lessons learned from those, and also to give you a sense of the city's history. So in 1960, a plan was done called the Comprehensive Master Plan of Flint, Michigan and Environs. And it was completed by the Cincinnati, Ohio firm of Ladislas, Sego and Associates, and Charles W. Matthews was the principal associate. The priorities stated in the cover letter for the plan include the development of new plats or new housing developments, new thoroughfares and parks, refashioning the central business district or downtown, and also the need for community renewal to remove blight, because there was already housing stock that was 60, 80, and 100 years old that needed to be replaced. The demographic analysis at that time showed that, quote, population growth trends in Flint have fluctuated greatly over the years. The new feature that was recognized at that time was the evolving pattern of decentralized residential development that was apparent in the declining ratio of Genesee County's population living in Flint. In the 1930s, approximately 70% of all county residents lived within the city of Flint boundaries. Today, it's down to approximately 20, and in the 1960s, it was approximately 40%. So there was a substantial change by 1960 relative to the pre-war years. The plan called for additional schools and parks, but traffic was the major concern. As the region was growing and the major employment centers, that is the General Motors factories, were primarily in the city of Flint. So the plan noted, quote, a principal deficiency is the lack of continuous and direct arterials of adequate capacity to carry traffic to and from the major traffic generators. So the plan recognized that decentralization, but in retrospect, it's clear that the recommendations in the plan actually accelerated that trend. It made it easier for people to get in and out of the city without taking account of how to develop the commercial districts along those thoroughfares, or to offer the type of housing options that were being made available through newer housing developed on the suburban growth fringe. Now, one curious feature of the plan is that there was substantial analysis done of the wider urbanized region, the places where you had a high residential density outside of the city's boundaries, but there's no indication, and this is something I'm going to look into further, that there was actually any engagement with public officials outside of the city of Flint, in the county or the surrounding municipalities. So the first few pages of the plan contain dozens of lists of Flint officials, but none others. So this raises one important point for my perspective as an elected official, which is more about the applicability of analysis and the political dimension of decision-making than about the analysis itself. But I wanted to note it here that there needs to be some relationship between the data presented and the spatial boundaries of that data and the individuals who are empowered to actually make those decisions. It may have been quite a different outcome for the Flint and Genesee County region if, in fact, there was a collective multi-municipality commitment to developing that greater urbanized area in a coordinated fashion, as opposed to the city of Flint looking at that wider region simply for its own purposes. So the usefulness of data is not only, in this case, based on accuracy, you could say, but also by the government bodies that are engaged with it, and the alignment of authority between those governmental bodies and the analysis. So I hope that researchers are aware of the political and institutional context, especially when work is being performed for public entities or for some public benefit. Now, stepping back again into 1920, the city of Flint It was called the City Plan of Flint, Michigan in 1920. And this was actually done by a renowned national urban planner, John Nolden, who was based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this was also written at a time when the community was rapidly growing. In fact, what turns out to be its most rapid growth on a percentage basis. And this presented a unique situation, just as today's planning has to account for the unprecedented 3 prior decades of decline. Nolan was very sensitive and aware of this dynamic. I have a long quote to read from the 1920 plan, so bear with me. He wrote that the 4-fold increase in population in the last 10 years, think about that, 4-fold increase. So the city's population went from 20,000 to 80,000 within 10 years, is a remarkable record for any city to make, and one that causes a sense of pride if one only looks to size as an indication of success, but is also a record that carries with it the serious charge to meet the new conditions and to give to Flint a name that stands for more than mere bigness. That's on page 10 of the 1920 plan. So for Nolan, cities were about more than size, as he looked to balance economic activity with places for recreation and with what we now would call quality of life. In fact, Flint's dramatic expansion presented the planner with a challenge for projecting the future. And Nolan noted the surprising increase in the population in the last 5 years is not common growth and cannot be used as a sure basis for predicting the future. He said, with the new demands of peace, this was in the post-World War I era, it is safe, however, to predict that the automobile industry will continue to expand, and with it will come continued growth for Flint. If the present trend is taken as a true indication, the 150,000 mark in population would be reached at 1922 at the latest, and 200,000 before 1925. But, he wrote, other factors are bound to come into play. And in these times of general transition and adjustment, it is unwise to judge from the past conditions. What was coming for Flint, in fact, was continued growth, but we would never reach the 200,000 level. We came very close to it in the late 1950s. It actually took us 30 more years to get to that point because of the intervening conditions of the Great Depression and World War II. So the early explosion of Flint's population was, of course, tied to the growing automobile industry and the need for additional factory workers. People moved to Flint from all across, primarily the country, not so much international immigration, but immigration from the near South, Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee. Those populations filled the city, both white as well as black. But to give you a sense of this incredible growth, not only in population but also in economics, the factory payroll in Flint grew from approximately $4 million in 1909, this is not adjusted for inflation, to over $40 million 10 years later. So Nolan proposed the steady increase in the number of factory workers is always another and hopeful indication of growth of the city as a whole and an index of its prosperity. So Nolan took a look at these conditions. He made his caveats about the unwise nature of projecting too far into the future based on these rapid transitions. He noted a series of implications of this population and economic growth. He proposed the extension of water and sewer mains, of road improvements, the development of this car system that I mentioned earlier, development of an East Side industrial district, which became known later as Buick City, with larger railroad facilities to facilitate the factory development. He also proposed public ownership of riverbanks and areas around creeks and ponds. I'll say something about that in a minute because it became an important part of our current master plan, was to return to some of his original thinking about how to balance economic growth with quality of life and access to green space. Just one more point on cars. When you think of what this means for a city, Nolan noted that the need for road improvements to accommodate cars was apparent because the automobile has changed traffic requirements and set new standards for width, grade, and degree of curvature in the laying out of new streets. So the design of streets had to change to accommodate the automobile, just like I was proposing that we want to again change the curvature and the width and the function of our roads in a time when we want to encourage more pedestrian activity and bicycle activity and a more multimodal transportation system. So with all of that taking place, there was this need, as Nolan saw it, for a large valley park, parkways, neighborhood and school parks to bring natural beauty and health into the city. And the fact that the areas around the river were already developed presented a challenge. So this shows you the city of Flint and the green spaces you can see today. This is current conditions. Follow the river, follow Kersley Creek and Swartz Creek and Thread Lake. And in Nolan's original vision of greenways that connected the city, these areas are identified in the red as places that we now want to expand our greenways. And I thought, since we were here at Kettering, we could talk for a minute about this place. Currently, we are right there, and this is owned by Kettering University. These are former factory sites. And you may have seen the signage that these areas are being phytoremediated with trees and other environmental interventions. So we now have an opportunity, because of the deindustrialization that's taking place, to actually go back and fulfill Nolan's original vision of a green parkway along the Flint River, even recapturing these purple districts, which are industrial properties currently still zoned that way. For park space. And this is, again, I know you're not able to see the detail, but that's the current master site plan for what the 150 acres of concrete along the Flint River will look like in about 3 to 5 years. We have the first $3 million secured to do this part of the project. Kettering University sits right here above some vacant property. They'll be redeveloping this section, and we'll be greening this as well as the entryway into downtown. So in the new plan, we're going back to some of what Nolan envisioned for the city, and this time we intend to actually enforce the vision, because what happened was the demands for residential growth encroached on the vision proposed in the 1920s plan. So we intend to abide by that as we allow for some greater flexibility. So briefly now, to come to some points of discussion, this is just one population trend line that I put together so you could see this rapid expansion. Here's where we were in the 1920 plan being developed, and it's an incredible expansion. We did get to that 150,000 mark, but then we had those 20 years of stability with the pressures of the war and the Great Depression, and now we're somewhere probably just below 100,000 today. So 3 notes that I touched on as we went through here, some food for thought as the conference proceeds and each of you continue in your own work. This notion of aligning data and boundaries with governance and authority. If there's an interest in work being done that's effective in the public sphere, then there's a need to align these areas of analysis with governance structures in order to make the most effective use of the data. And you can see that especially the 1960s plan, if we had more time to go into it, there was a real disconnect between the analysis of Flint and its environs and the governance structure which was strictly around the city of Flint. The other point is about scale and place and this spatial aggregation of data. Planners spend a lot of time thinking about places and collecting data about those places. And I think it's a point that's often missed, that every statistic about a community, whether it's census data or survey data, carries with it some assumptions about place. And we want to be sensitive to those. So when we talk about City of Flint statistics, that's actually made up, of course, of neighborhood statistics. And those neighborhoods are made up of block statistics. And those blocks are made up of individual statistics or scales. So in geography, we call this the geographic fallacy, that we need to be careful of drawing assumptions about one scale if in fact our data is from another scale, and be sensitive to what that means. And what we found in this process is that the citywide averages and citywide projections, we believe, were not quite the right unit of analysis. We believe that the important unit of analysis was this sub-municipal neighborhood scale and how those aggregated to create a citywide picture. You would never come up with this variegated land use pattern looking at city averages. If you did that, you would just have smooth areas of neighborhood and commercial district, when in fact we believe that there's a lot more quality of life to offer our residents by thinking carefully about areas that will be lower density green neighborhoods and higher density mixed residential areas, and being specific about where those are going to go. Not just saying we want 15,000 more units built, but saying we want 5,000 of them to be here, and we want 10 more thousand of them to be here. So that was something that I wanted to mention. I've talked a lot about land use here. Let me give you a different analogy. You've probably all kind of at one point or another heard the term hot spots when it comes to crime. There's been a lot of attention over the last 20 years to the geographic nature of crime data and how patrols and other police interventions can be designed around places where there's high incidence of crime, these hot spots. The notion that you need to put cops on dots, the places where crime is taking place. Well, as that research has evolved, we've actually come back to a much more traditional understanding of this, which is there really aren't hot spots. There are hot people. There are people who commit crimes. There aren't places that have high rates of crime. So the most effective law enforcement interventions are to identify those individuals who have violent criminal records, go in and search through the paper file, which is too often still in paper form, and recognize that they have outstanding warrants, and you can go and arrest them for a previous crime for which they have been likely the perpetrator of. You don't need to catch them in a new act. You can actually get them off the street for something that they've already done. So that's a case at a little different scale where it's not so much about the neighborhood, it's more about the individual. In the case of planning, while people inhabit the city, we believe that it's much more about the place and the neighborhood and the district. The last one, and I had the quote up here on the 1920s plan just to reiterate this point. I missed it. That the transportation consultant on the 1920s plan wrote that the extraordinary recent industrial growth of Flint makes it necessary to depend to an unusual extent upon judgment and foresight rather than upon precedent in providing for the future as well as for the present city's needs. So this, as a concluding point, just emphasizes that as important as the research and analysis is, that when that research analysis is contextualized, it's not always the data itself or the trend line that is likely to be most determinant. It's actually how that data is used and interpreted and how it comes to shape the opportunities, and in this case around city planning, the opportunities for residential growth or decline, business and commercial or institutional investments that actually proves to make the most difference, as well as, of course, the host of factors happening at the state or federal or international or technological scales that have a profound impact on all of our communities. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and if time allows, I'd be happy to take a question or two about the city or something that's happening now or something that I presented. So thank you. So we can have the lights back up. So we can, okay. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. What are the major tools in your disposal as a mayor to draw in investment and increase quality of life and increase the population size? What a mayor can do?
Yeah, thank you. So this is really about the work plan around the city's master plan. So it's my contention that the first thing that you need to do is establish the framework, that you need to be able to show an investor market trends, opportunities for new development and growth, so that they're not having to do all of that work themselves. So a master plan is a major first step. And then for those of you who know something about how cities are run in the United States, then there are two other major tools that follow from the plan. One is the zoning code, which gives a great amount of detail in regulating what size of buildings, type of business activities or residential activities or densities are allowed in different parts of the city. So we currently still have the 1960 zoning code in the city. So it's been modified in a few cases, but it's very traditional. It's very much about defining a particular use for a particular property or part of the city. What you'll see in this, when I showed you the pictures, even though we're calling something a green neighborhood, you actually have a variety of activities and uses within that place. So the new zoning code will be flexible, will allow for a diverse range of residential and business opportunities throughout the city. And then the last is, as a public body, we provide a number of necessary and vital services for any household or enterprise to flourish: public safety, water services, sewer services, street lighting, and all of that depends on appropriate capital investment. And one of the problems in Flint in the last few decades is that we've been in an emergency mode of just doing the crisis and not making investments. And that becomes, as the old saying goes, penny wise but pound foolish. So we will be adopting a new capital improvement plan that will lay out how we'll be investing our transportation funding, our utility funding, what we'll be doing to upgrade our street lights. So those are all things that I believe create the environment or the climate for business growth and opportunities. We like to talk about creating jobs as elected officials. We create the environment in which jobs can flourish and residents can find a high quality of life that they want to stay in and invest in. So those are the things that we'll be finishing over the next 6 months. Morning.
Two-part question for you. With all of the new initiatives that I think may be going on in the city, like strong cities, strong communities, I think that's an initiative that may be coming this way. I think I've heard different things like promised neighborhoods and things of that nature. I view those more as a data gathering initiative as well as a community support initiative. So my first question is along the lines of what type of reporting or transparency comes along with those types of initiatives? Number one, is that information that'll be publicly available to people, or is that information that's strictly proprietary and for use for the development of the city? That's the first question. And the second question is more along the lines of social enterprise. With so many different nonprofits, organizations working, hopefully collaborating cohesively to develop the city of Flint, how does the whole concept of these organizations generating revenue from someone other than maybe the city or from the government, what does that look like with all of the social enterprise conversations going on right now?
Okay, thanks. Great question. So, Strong City, Strong Communities is a new initiative of the president's to bring kind of federal government technical assistance into cities. It's not so much a grant program as a technical assistance program. And you'll be happy to know that Paul Joyce from the U.S. Department of Housing and Development is actually here today. He works in the Office of Policy and Research for the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Development. He's now a Flint resident and is living and working here for the next year or so to be of assistance to us. So we will be applying for other programs like Promise Neighborhoods that do carry with it federal grant funding. And the master plan is a wonderful source of data as well as a set of strategies that we can use for any of those competitions so that we're not starting from scratch. What you're going to find is that just like the planning process was transparent, the entire plan, all the technical studies, all the prior studies that were analyzed to create this are all available at imagineflint.com. The planning director, Paul Joyce, will be involved in this from Strong City, Strong Communities. We'll be working out the platform for reporting progress on the master plan. We do continue to have our community steering committee in place. They meet publicly on a monthly basis, normally the first Tuesday of the month at the Flint Public Library. So you'll be hearing more about how we'll be tracking and reporting on that. It certainly will all be publicly available. As far as social enterprise, that's another presentation that I could give. The master plan has 13 chapters. The land use plan is chapter 4, transportation and parks chapters, which I alluded to. The other chapters relate to economic development and education, public health, safety and welfare, arts and culture. So there's a great deal of strategy that's been laid out, and your term, which I liked and we use often, of social enterprise, we think is very important in a community that has very limited market and traditional economic resources, but has a great deal of cultural and community resiliency, and there's an emerging field of business, nonprofit, blended organizations, however they're legally organized, enterprises that are deliberate about a community benefit. There's a very exciting one going on in the north side of the city with a couple of nuns at St. Luke's New Life Center, where they're training men and women to sew. They're sewing hospital gowns that are being sold to local medical centers, and that's putting people to work that otherwise would not have been likely to be able to go to a traditional place of employment, turn in their application, and actually get a job. So we see a lot of community benefit in that, and the president of Diplomat Specialty Pharmacy, which has become one of our new larger employers, he's made the comment that we could see hundreds, possibly thousands of jobs in this social enterprise sector in the coming years, and Diplomat is one of the companies that's supporting that. So a lot more to be said about that area, but we're in the people business in government. I talked a lot about planning and buildings and infrastructure systems, but there's another side of this that's about the people and families. Okay.
Actually, I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
The comment is you are the only politician that I have seen who has not abused the data to your advantage. Kudos for that.
Yeah.
And what a way to start the conference on statistics where data should not be abused.
Yeah, thank you.
And the question is, are there any plans for making Flint a wireless city?
Yeah, wireless city. I mean, this is another infrastructure issue that now comes into play given our current context. And we've looked at a number of different models, so we're going to continue to explore that. There's also the opportunity, and Dr. McMahon and I have had conversations about the opening up the broadband capacity, the fiber capacity that we have in this community and could expand. So cities across the country are really experimenting with how to do this. I think it's easy to forget the fact that, 10 years ago, most of the social technologies and internet capabilities that we've come to take for granted didn't exist. So just like communities had to go from horse and carriages to cars over 20 and 30 years, we're now in the midst of that same kind of revolution. So that's something that we hope to figure out, but we don't have a defined strategy for how to make it work between the company providers and the market dynamics and our limited resources.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
One last question for you, sir.
Sure.
Relative to analytics, statistics analytics, a very intimidating subject matter for most people in the community who probably would rather watch paint dry, I would imagine, than really get into the nuts and bolts of calculations. So if an organization were to pick a target area to say, we're going to take this complicated subject matter and we're going to explain it to people who normally probably would run away from it, for the purpose of advancing your agenda of utilizing statistics to strategically build a city. What areas would you say that such an organization should focus on? And so I guess let me condense that question.
Yeah.
If I were to focus on, I'm really into mathematics and business intelligence and all of those types of things. So if I were to focus on trying to support your agenda in embracing a few areas in statistics, what would you feel those greatest opportunities would be for the city of Flint?
So I know you can't see it particularly well, but there are a number of areas in the plan that are outside of downtown that are coded red. These are our neighborhood business centers, places where we want to bring back the walkable, small-scale neighborhood retail that actually defined American cities 100 years ago and then got replaced by suburban strip malls. So in a number of places, like at the corner of Clio Road and Pearson, South Saginaw Street, West Corunna, there are this is Pasadena and North Saginaw. There are opportunities for neighborhood retail development. You mentioned on a business, analytics. At the end of the day, however, I think the approach of getting the public involved, I mentioned this is, you could say, is a kind of peer review of sorts for people in my line of work who are ultimately accountable to the public. When we built this land use plan, and there's another graphic in the document that actually shows how we took feedback from the public, and we know the public wouldn't understand that our market could only support 8 neighborhood business centers. So our planning consultants did the work with the market data and residential patterns and commuter patterns and identified that the city would be best served if it had 8 neighborhood business centers. So when we had the public workshops, teams at each table were given 8 red stickers, and they had to put them in the places where they believed would be best served by a neighborhood business center. So the public didn't have to understand the calculated algorithms behind the market and the projections. They just had to put 8 red dots, on the map. And then we got that from 100 tabletop teams, and then our consultants again compiled those, looked for the places where they overlapped, compared it to their own economic data and projections, and came up with the ones that we kind of ultimately adopted. So I think any area that you'd like to follow up with me on, or the planning staff, they would be happy to work with you to develop a public engagement process that simplifies the very complicated kind of data and projections, and still gives the public an opportunity to, you could say, kind of validate where those places should be based on their own experience and their own assumptions and knowledge of those areas, which is incredibly valuable when you're doing this type of work. Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker. It was absolutely wonderful presentation. As we mentioned at the beginning, we are so privileged to have a mayor with such a background. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you all. Have a wonderful conference and welcome again to Flint.